This summer, we're thinking together about what we can put our minds on when we are worried or weary, when we feel afraid or ashamed or alone. Life throws things at us that cause us to feel that way, cause us to feel worried or weary or ashamed or afraid. And that's what we're looking at now. What can we think of when we are conscious of fear? When I'm afraid, I want to do a couple of things. I want to increase the distance from what threatens me. And there's a couple ways to do that. Fear is a response to a perceived threat. If something is close to you that might threaten you in some way, either emotionally or physically, it could be a number of different things. It could be a circumstance, it could be a person. What we want to do is increase the distance from what threatens us, and there's two ways we can do that. If we feel we're stronger than the threat, we can make it go away. We can fight it and try to cause it to go away. Or if we don't think we're strong enough, we run away. But either way, if I make it go away or if I run away from it, what I want to do when I'm afraid is I want to increase the distance from what threatens me. But that's not the only thing I want to do. Second thing, I want to decrease the distance to one who loves me. When we're afraid, we not only want to get rid of what threatens us, but it's very natural. In fact, it's instinctive for us to draw close to one who is perceived by us as one who cares and loves us. That's why when you were young, talking about having bad dreams, I'll never forget that dream. I forget I was dreaming about, but I remember what I did. It was scary. And I thought that suit of clothes was something, and I just went and I made a beeline for my parents' bed, and that's where I slept the night. Why? Because I wanted to get away from that, but I wanted to be close to one who loves me. Both of those things are instinctive reactions we have when we feel afraid. I think the point then is love decreases fear. Love decreases fear. It says in right before the verse that we're going to look at, but perfect love drives out fear, it says there is no fear in love. There is no fear in love. Fear and love are like oil and water. They can't occupy the same space, and that's what fear and love are like. They can't occupy the same space. If fear is there, then it pushes love out. If love is there, it pushes fear out. How do you know that? That's what it says here. There is no fear in love. They can't be in the same place. I was talking to somebody in China, and he was talking about his son and some things he saw, habits and patterns that he saw in his son, and he was rolling out this list of what ifs and oh no's. What if, oh no, what if, oh no. And he saw some things that were really scary. And he went on for about 10 or 15 minutes, and I said, you know what? I'm hearing a lot about this and that, and all these things could happen. The one thing that was absent, God was entirely removed from the picture. God's love was entirely absent, and that's what seems to happen. When we are overwhelmed by things that are frightening, then God gets pushed out. When we are conscious of God's love, then fear gets pushed out. Why? They're like oil and water. There is no fear in love. Increased awareness of fear will mean decreased awareness of being loved. The more focused I am on what frightens me, now I'm not going to come away and say, don't be afraid, just think about God. That's not realistic. However, we're put, there is no fear in love. And so what that means then is increased awareness of fear will mean decreased awareness of love. That seems to be what the verse is implying, and vice versa. Increased awareness of being loved will mean decreased awareness of fear. It doesn't mean that fear will totally be removed, but it won't become as powerful. There's a couple people in the Bible that you could probably think of many. David seems to be one like that. There was a lot of things David did that he deserved to be really frightened of. But what he was aware of is that God was with him. That's why Goliath didn't look so scary to David, because he was aware that God was with him. Even when he did some things that were very sinful things, caused somebody to be murdered, his image of God's love was even bigger than the sin which he had done. Now that's quite a thing. It's quite a thing. His image of God's love and God's grace, the things God could provide, was huge to David, and it's even bigger than the sin that he committed. Another person, naturally, we think of as Jesus. On the night before he was to be betrayed, he said to the disciples, "You will leave me all alone, yet I am not alone, for my Father is with me." Jesus faced some very frightening things. In fact, later on that night, when he thinks about what he's going to face, he sweats drops of blood. He's very agitated, very much taken up with what's going to happen. However, he felt that fear. That's why it can't be bad to feel fear. Jesus felt it. That fear did not overpower him. It did not dictate what he did, because he was aware as well that the Father was with him. And to the degree he was able to lean into the Father's love for him, he was able to do what he needed to be doing, and his life wasn't directed by fear. How many people's lives are directed by fear? You ask them, what are you going to do? And many people's lives are oriented towards that. The thing that drives them is to move them as far away as possible for something that's threatening, to insulate themselves. And that can't work. It didn't work for Jesus. God doesn't promise us that he will insulate us from scary things. And that's what Jesus is indicating to us, is that for him, he faced scary things, and we're going to face scary things as well. There's reasons that we would be afraid. And what Jesus said, okay, there's some scary things, but I am not alone because the Father is with me, and that's what Jesus tells us. To the degree we become aware of the love of God, it will decrease the power of fear. Fear reminds us of our need for love. What are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? We're all afraid of something. You have financial fears? Geez, just don't know how things are going to balance out. You have kid fears? Some of you children are leaving for college. It's scary. Kid fears, student fears. Number of things we could be afraid of. Physical fears. Fear reminds us what it says of our need to be loved. Now, there's a couple things. Fear will oftentimes, there will be things that we have to do to meet the threat that faces us. We can't just keep our focus on heaven and not do anything about threats that face us. However, the thing that we're not always conscious of is that fear reminds us of our need for love, because again, there's no fear in love. And we oftentimes try to meet the fear solely on the grounds of trying to remove it. And what ends up happening, we become really good at insulating ourselves from things that scare us. We become good at solving problems. We use people to help us to get rid of the fears that face us. We make people change so that we won't be afraid. We make people do this so that we don't need to be afraid. Now, we tell people this is for your own good, but it's really, that's not what it's about. It's because you're going to do something that's going to make me afraid, and I don't want to be afraid. And we can fix our lives and distance ourselves from fear, but you know what ends up happening? We end up pushing people around and using people. When I use people to reduce my fear, that doesn't always work so well, because people don't always go along with what we want them to do. And we end up pushing people away sometimes when we deal with fear by trying to make our life not fearful. What it says is, perfect love drives out fear. Love decreases fear. And what we want to do sometimes is move closer to somebody who loves us. Many of us, when we think of being afraid, think about how to fix it. And what it's saying, at some point with a loved one, sometimes saying, you know what, I'm afraid of this or that, is a better thing to do. Now, you're going to have to do some things, but just admitting that, you know, here's what I'm afraid of, it brings you closer to another person. You've experienced that, haven't you? Some of us are so quick to fix that we don't draw close to people. And drawing close to somebody is something that causes the fear to be reduced, not just fixing situations. Drawing close to people, how do we know that? There's no fear in love. There's no fear in love. The increased awareness of being loved decreases the awareness of being afraid. The increased awareness of being afraid decreases the awareness of being loved. They're like oil and water, so draw close to somebody. I guess the problem is that there are some fears that drawing close to people can deal with. You know, like if you're a kid and you have a bad dream, crawling into a parent's bed can do the trick, but we grow up and the fears are not so easily removed. Bad things happen that even good connections with people cannot seem to take the edge off our fear. We want to be protected. There's things that scare us, and the love of a husband isn't enough. The love of a wife isn't enough. We still find ourselves being afraid, and our lives are driven by fear. Their love is not enough. They're not big enough. They're not always able to be there. Their love is flawed. Fear reminds us of our need for perfect love. All of us deal with fear. Rationalizations can't deal with fear. We'd say, well, it really might not happen. The fact is, it might happen. And there's things to be afraid of. Money can't drive out fear. Now, having a bunch of money can seem to take the edge off of it, but when the dust settles, money is not enough to make us not afraid. In fact, those who have lots of money will tell you that with lots of money, then you have to worry about how you're going to keep it. And it really doesn't remove the fear. It just adds a different level of fear. Now, not only am I afraid of what I'm afraid of, now I've got to protect the money so that I cannot be afraid of what I'm afraid of. It just increases the things that we're afraid of. Good families cannot drive out fear. In fact, love cannot drive out fear. Love cannot drive out fear. That's not what this verse says. Love decreases fear all the time, but love cannot drive it out. What it says, perfect love drives out fear. Maybe that's a place where we go awry. We look to somebody to try to give us something that ultimately can't work. We look to a wife or to a husband, to a parent or to a child, and we rely on them to be the one that makes us not afraid. And what ends up happening, they end up disappointing us, and we become angry. Don't you love me enough? And maybe the problem is not their love. Maybe the problem is that they're not God, and their love is not perfect. It says perfect love drives out fear. That's what it says. Perfect love drives out fear. I don't care how loving your husband is. He does not love perfectly. Therefore, for you to depend on your husband to remove your fear will not work, and you will end up being angry either at yourself or at your husband. Husbands, a wife, she cannot drive out your fear. She cannot be the one you always look to remove your fear. Why? She doesn't love you perfectly. Kids, parents are not a source of perfect love. You know, growing up through elementary age and teenage years, there's a distance from parents that starts to happen. There's love there, but you have to go in other directions. And parents don't love perfectly. A mother's love is probably about as perfect a love as you're going to find here, but that's not perfect. And the problem is, if the love's not perfect, fear always finds a way to sneak in. Have you found that? If the love isn't perfect, fear always can find a way to creep back in. We try to convince ourselves there's nothing to be afraid of, and we think of what's in, and then just peeks its head right in through the crack. Fear finds a way in, like water through a crack in a foundation, which is something I'm kind of afraid of. But I haven't been afraid of this summer, so well, okay. We can go from well to well, wondering why we're so unhappy. Relationship to relationship. It felt good as long as I felt like you were already going to be there, but you're not always going to be there, and now I need to go to somebody else because you're not always there. It might not be that person's fault. It might be you're trying to depend on someone to give you something they can't give you. Perfect love. Perfect love drives out fear. Fear reminds us of our need for perfect love. Perfect love drives out fear. I wonder if fear drives out love. What do you think? Fear drive out love? Seems to say that becoming preoccupied with fear removes or reduces our sense of being loved. People talk about not being in love with people. In our culture, sometimes love is more an emotion. Biblically, love is something that one does for another. Mark talked about it last week, the things that love looks like, how love acts. It's very active. Love is a verb. It's what one person does to care about another person. But in our society, we see love as emotion, something that we fall into or fall out of. We feel that we don't just love them anymore. I wonder how often that's a result of not really about love at all, but about fear. If I start to feel, if your love doesn't reduce my fear, then I can become very conscious of the fact that I don't feel loved, but that really might not be the problem with the person. It might be the problem that I am trying to use somebody's love to reduce my fear, and that won't work long term. And so I might feel like I've fallen out of love, but you know what the real thing might be? Falling out of love could well be an indication of falling into fear. Falling into fear. They say that in a marriage, 3 to 5 years is a time when a lot of people fall out of love. They become afraid that the other person is not going to change those irritating things. That happens in 3 to 5 years in a marriage. And it's a critical period, 3 to 5 to 7 years. Sometimes a couple will stay together, and then 18 to 24 years, when the kids are out of the house, there's falling out of love. But I wonder if that's falling into fear. A sense of strangeness with this person that you're not sure you know anymore. And sometimes the temptation is, well, I don't love you anymore, therefore, I need to find another person to love. When it might not be a love problem at all. It might be a fear problem. And to deal with the fear problem, love helps, but perfect love is really what the Bible will talk about, because perfect love, the Bible will say, drives out fear. Look what it says in the sheet that I've included. Under point 2, here's the verse, but perfect love drives out fear. We say that together, just that front part. But sometimes with things biblically, this verse says a lot in a very few words. But perfect love drives out fear. Say it one more time. Does it say love drives out fear? Does love drive out fear? Some fears, but perfect love drives out any kind of fear. And when you're looking for perfect love, there's only one person that is the source of that kind of love, and that's God. Perfect love drives out fear because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. We love because he first loved us. I think here's maybe a way that things work. Fearful God consciousness leads to fearful self-consciousness. Fearful God consciousness, being conscious of God and being afraid, leads to fearful self-consciousness where I'm not thinking of God, I'm thinking of myself, and I think that I'm a target. And what it seems to say is that fearful God consciousness leads to fearful self-consciousness, and we're not so thinking about God, but we're very aware of being vulnerable. And those two things are connected. Remember Adam and Eve in the garden? Adam wasn't self-conscious at all. I mean, they were out there, no fig leaves, no nothing. Just kind of, yeah, just kind of out there. Whoa. And not self-conscious at all. There's no sense of, ooh. And then came to a place where he became very conscious that he was naked. Very self-aware, went to a place from he wasn't really looking at himself and being very aware of himself. He was free of that. Then we find the next frame, he's very self-aware, and they're putting fig leaves on, but still, when the fig leaves are on, it didn't cover the problem because he still feels exposed. When it says, I heard you in the garden and I was afraid because I was naked. So I hid. At that point, they weren't naked. They had fig leaves on, but the fig leaves didn't help them to feel less exposed. Why? See, the problem wasn't that he was self-conscious. That was the result. What was the problem? Sin caused him to not be able to be confident that God did love and care for him. And in the absence of a consciousness of a God who loved him, then he became very aware of himself. Fearful God consciousness led to fearful self-consciousness. When we're conscious of someone, that they are loving and watching over us, we're free from having to watch over ourselves. I've told you this story, but it's a thing I still see in my mind. Gavin and I are walking through a store. I forget where it was. I think it was Target or something like that. He was like 2 or 3. And he was just running up the aisles and down and he came to a place where he froze. And he was very conscious at that point that he was afraid. And what he did then, he froze and he turned around and he looked at me. And then he scampered off again. What was his problem? He had lost confidence that he was being watched over. And when he lost the confidence that he was being watched over, he started to become concerned, very frightened and self-aware. And then when he saw that he was being watched over, he was free again, and he ran up and down the aisles. I wonder if it could be the same with God. To the degree we're conscious that God watches over us, is loving, caring, to the degree we are aware of that, because that's what love means. Love does not mean that God looks and says, oh, I love you, but I'm not very powerful. I can't do much. For God, love is a verb. It's active. It's something he does. He protects. He watches. He cares. He doesn't abandon. He doesn't leave us alone. That's what love means for God. It's active. To the degree we're conscious that he watches over us, it reduces the power of our self-consciousness. Fearful, on the other side, fearful God consciousness leads to fearful self-consciousness. Is it possible not to be afraid? Possible not to be afraid? Not in this world. There are scary things. If you're not afraid, and if you never deal with fear, you don't know yourself very well. We all deal with fear. Some of us pretend we don't. We all do. Is it possible not to be afraid? No, it isn't. We show our fear different ways. Some of us hide, some of us fix, but we all feel afraid. Is it possible to deal effectively with fear? I think so, when we understand what triggers it. When we believe it's just about eliminating threats, we cannot deal effectively with fear. And if our sense is that in order to deal with fear, I just need to make my life so that it's protected from everything. Money, relationships, I need protection on all sides. That is not dealing effectively with fear. Fear will always find a way in. When we believe it's just about eliminating threats, we can't deal effectively with fear. When we understand that fear is the call for perfect love, then we can deal effectively with fear. Then we can deal effectively with fear. When we don't deal effectively with fear, fearful self-consciousness leads to sinful self-centeredness. Remember what happened when Satan was able to plant a seed in Adam's mind relative to how much God really loved and cared for him? Do you remember what he said? Oh, God didn't really say you won't die. God lies. And the reason why God didn't want you to eat from the tree is that he doesn't want you to be like him, knowing good and evil. So you can't trust God to care about you. You can't trust God to tell the truth. You can't trust God to care about you. And when that seed was planted, that became a fearful thing. Fearful God consciousness led to a self-consciousness and to choices that because of the lack of confidence in God, the choices seemed like good choices. I need to have all kinds of knowledge so I can protect myself if God won't. And the pull of hunger, the pull of wisdom was not sufficient. They had nothing with which to resist it. Why? Perfect love drives out fear. She became afraid. What if I'm not protected? What if I'm not provided for? Fearful God consciousness leads to fearful self-consciousness. And fearful self-consciousness leads to sinful self-centeredness. Look what it says in this verse. Marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. Keep your lives free from the love of money. Be content with what you have. Because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? What we find here is that fearful self-consciousness leads to sinful self-centeredness. When we feel alone, when we feel exposed, that there's no one who cares for us, it leads to becoming preoccupied with ourselves, which this verse would indicate starts to cause problems. And if you look at the problems, what it seems is that the leaves of evil, when we look at what this verse says, the leaves of evil, what we see is sexual immorality and greed. It says, let the marriage bed be kept undefiled. And it's talking about the absence of sexual immorality. Keep sex within the confines of a committed marital relationship. That's what it's indicating. And let your lives be free from the love of money. Do not be intent on creating a huge cache of cash in order to protect yourself. So it's describing the things that we're not to do, but at the heart of it, the root of evil is disbelief, because that's what he ends up talking about. Look what it says again. Marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. Keep your lives free from the love of money. Be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? And what he seems to be saying is that if you want to get to the heart of what drives greed, if you want to get to the heart of what drives sexual immorality, it's the sense that God may leave me. God may leave me. And God may forsake me. Because God may leave me, I need to get all the love that I can, even if it means crossing a sexual barrier. Because God may not provide for me, I need to get all the cash that I can because he may not provide. At the leaves of the problem is sexual immorality and greed, but if you trace it back to where it came from, it's a belief issue. God may not. He may not stay with me. God may not provide for me. The belief leads to the behavior. So if you deal with greed, you deal with greed. I think we all deal with stuff like that with money. What it says, at the bottom of the problem with greed is the problem of disbelief and self-centeredness. Again, what we're doing is just pointing out, if you want to deal effectively with it, we've got to find out where it comes from. Some people focus on the behaviors. Don't be greedy or God will get you. That's not going to work. You can't make somebody afraid in order to cause them to believe that God loves them. It doesn't work. How does it work? You've got to drive home the belief. You know what? God is not going to leave us. He says he'll never leave us nor forsake us. And as that becomes part of our belief system, that gives us the ability not to become fearfully self-conscious and sinfully self-centered. God will provide for us. God is not going to leave you. But God's not going to leave you. But wait, God's not going to leave you. He will not forsake you. He will not turn his back on you. He will not go away in that sense, or he will not watch you and fail to care. And what it indicates, as we believe that, not just a lazy belief, grab it. That's the way to deal with sexual immorality or greed, because belief is at the root of disobedience. If you deal with sexual immorality, internet, and again, this is not a thing that you're going to solve overnight, but if you want to get to the root of that problem, greed or sexual immorality, I don't care what it is. At the heart of that, it's not just a problem with sex. It's not just a problem with desires. The problem is unbelief. feel alone. You feel like maybe you're not provided for, you're not cared for. It didn't go the way you wanted it to go. It should have gone the way you wanted it to go. Frustration, and I look for a way out of frustration. At the heart of that, it's a belief issue. I talked to somebody once who was in the middle of a very long-standing affair, and good individual, just had a really hard time moving away from it. We talked, this is a long time ago. We talked, and then I asked about, when do you go towards this affair? I said, never thought of it. I said, does it happen when things at work aren't going very well? I said, come to think of it, it does. So that's interesting. Because what we know is that sexual release is the solution, but it really might not be the problem that caused the tension. Maybe the problem that's increasing the tension is work-related, and you're recruiting sexual release to be a solution to get rid of the tension. I wonder if there's another way to deal with the tension on this side. He said, what do you mean? Well, I wonder what it might mean if you were to claim God's promises relative to your work. What do you mean? He says, well, he says, he will put his law in your mind and write it on your heart, and he will do in you what needs to be done in order for you to be the person he wants you to be. I wonder what it might be like for you to put your confidence in the fact that God is in you when you're in the middle of a place where work seems threatening and fearful. Whoa, never thought of that. Never thought of that. It says, God will be your father and you will be his child. Good's ahead of you. I wonder what it might be like for you to focus on the fact that not only is God in you, God is with you. And he doesn't leave you on Sunday. He goes with you to work. I wonder what it might be like to think about the fact that God is there and that if he leads you, you're not going to end up in a bad place, that God will cause things to work together for good. I wonder what might happen if you start to claim that promise. He goes, boy, I never thought of that. And I wonder, and I said, I wonder what it might be like to think about the fact that God said, he will forgive your wickedness and remember your sin no more, that there'd be nothing that would cause God not to keep his promises. And this guy's blown away. He goes, I said, here's what I want you to do. I want you, when you're aware of being tense and fearful at work, I want you to start to lean into these promises. And I wrote them down, and I gave it to him. And I said, this is not magic, but as your belief in these increases, I think it will help. And if the tension can be dissipated this way, I don't think you'll need that. He said, okay. And then I talked to him a couple weeks, and then successfully, now this was dramatic in this case, so it's not like a magic formula. Some of you deal with this and say, what are those things? And it's not always so quick, but with this guy, it was, I don't even understand why I went over there now to begin with. It's because when I found a different way to deal with the tension and the fear, I didn't have to go over here to remove the tension. And I don't know what that is. Tension can be sexual, it can be addiction, number of different things. There is no fear in love. Perfect love drives out fear. Fear will not be escorted nicely. It's not that, okay, here you go. Come on now, let's go. That's not drive out. The word for drive out is what Jesus did when he took the whip and cleared the courtyard. It's an aggressive term. There's only one thing in this world with the power to dominate and drive out fear. What is that? Love? Love drives out fear. Perfect love drives out fear. That's the only thing. That's one solution of one. The Bible talks about the love of God. What we see is that fearful God consciousness lies at the root of sinful self-centeredness. I think that's what we come to. If you trace it, fearful God consciousness lies at the root. You said, doesn't the Bible talk about the fear of God? It describes a reverence and an awe, not a terror, not a he might punish me. He says, how do you know that? Look at the verse again. In 1 John 4, 18 and 19, look at it again. There's some people that talk about being frightened and terrified of God. This verse is an embarrassment to somebody who says that. Look what it says. Perfect love drives out fear because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. To fear God's punishment means that you have more to learn about his love. I know people that use the sense of a mean punishing God. And what I know about that person is, you know what? I'm not going to down him, but you have more to learn about God's love. There's no fear in love because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. When you understand God's love, you understand that he's not going to punish you. When you understand he's not going to punish you, what happens? You stop being afraid of him. If you stop being afraid of him, you don't have to be fearfully self-conscious. If you're not fearfully self-conscious, you don't have to be sinfully self-centered. It all starts here. Perfect love drives out fear. God does not want you to be afraid of him. Reverence, absolutely. Awe, absolutely. Terror, he might punish me, absolutely not. It's the only solution. Strange as it seems, greed can only be dealt with by confidence in God's love and care. That's it. Confidence in God's love and care is the only way ultimately really to deal with greed or with sexual immorality or whatever it is that we deal with. A number of different sins. Confidence in God's love and care is at the heart of it. It's what God does. Look what it says, Romans 8. You did not receive a spirit that makes you a slave again to fear, but you received the spirit of sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. What God does in order to enable us to get over fear, he sends the Spirit into our hearts, and the Spirit is not a spirit that makes us a slave again to fear. It's saying the same thing. When you're in touch with God's influence, you're not frightened of God. You're conscious of being his child. And when you're aware of being his child, you know what's going to happen? We'll look at it again. You love me. You watch over me. That's what it means that God loves you. And by the way, God loves you. And that's not just a sicky sweet emotional sentiment. He will watch over you. He will never leave you or forsake you. God, why? Because God loves you. No. God loves you. Some of you are not hearing. God loves you. You say, well, so what? To the degree we become aware of that, it drives out fear. And fear is at the root of it. Fear replacing God's consciousness cannot be a lazy belief. It can't be something that you grab with two hands and, it's just kind of, okay, yeah, I'll think of that when I have time. It can't be a lazy belief. That's the problem in our society today. I think the thing that Satan does to cause Christian character to be pretty thin, I think it has to do with the fact that he promotes the knowledge of so many things that we don't believe anything. We don't believe anything. We want to get so much information, more broad books, seminars, TV, but we won't take something simple and believe it. And if you can't believe it, it's not going to change you. What should we believe? Here's what you can believe. Say it with me. But perfect love drives out fear. Say that. And what I'm saying, not that you would just kind of let that float through your mind. What I'm asking you to do, grab it. And when you become afraid, now this is the battle, but that's where, let your mind go in that direction. God is love. Perfect love drives out fear. Now there's things that you're going to have to do, but it's easier to think when you know that somebody has your back. I think that's the way it works. It can't be a lazy belief. It must be a firm reliance. It cannot be based on what we see. It must be based on what God says. God will not insulate us from difficulty. You're going to face scary things. I face scary things. And if your sense of being loved is based on what you see, you're going to be a very frightened person. Because God's not going to insulate you from scary things, scary possibilities. He wants your confidence to be based on what he says, not on what you see. You remember Jesus, what happened? God said, "You're my son whom I love." He heard this. Okay, God said, and he believed it. Then Satan came when there were difficult circumstances Jesus faced. He tried, if you're the Son of God, make him show it. What is that? That's an appeal, a temptation to make Jesus live by sight. Oh yeah, God told you, but God tells you a lot of things. You know what I mean? You can't trust what God says. You need to make God show you. That's the temptation. And God won't always do that. Why? Because he wants us to live by faith on the basis of what he says, not on what we see. God's not going to take away the scary things in your life. I'm sorry. You say, well, how can I deal with my fear? How can you deal with your fear? For your kids, for your job. There's things you have to do, but first step, you need to find some perfect love and believe it on the basis of what God says, not on what you see. When I'm afraid, and I'll have the worship team come up and we'll have a closing song. When I'm afraid, a couple places to go. God is love. God is love. When you base your confidence on the basis of what he says, this verse will never change. Circumstances cannot change this verse. When we put our confidence in what God says, it's an anchor, and perfect love drives out fear. When we're afraid, great things to remember. Let's say it one last time. But if life wasn't scary, that's the way I'd rather have it. I'd rather have it so that I don't have to say, what if, oh no. What you say is that there is a way that I can respond to my fear that would be more effective than trying to become really powerful or depending on people. You say perfect love drives out fear. And you tell us and invite us to be more mindful of you, to believe what you say. You tell us that it can't be a lazy belief, but a firm reliance. Something driven and based upon what you say to us. And I pray, would you give us the ability to be able to grab onto that? Maybe in the middle of scary times this week, maybe this verse will come to our mind. Perfect love drives out fear, and we'll find an ability to, again, not eliminate the fear, but to live in the face of it, knowing that we're not alone. I think that's what you want. Tell us about your love for us. Help us to believe it, to grab onto it. In Jesus' name.